Telling my children their father had died was one of the most complicated things I've ever had to do, because it wasn't just about giving them information. My oldest was 5, and his siblings were 3.5, 2, and 6 weeks old, which meant I had to explain to them what it means to be dead before I could tell them about their father's plane crash in the mountains of Nevada. And more importantly, I had to teach them, these small people, what it means to grieve. A lesson that could powerfully impact the way they'd interact with his death and their grief for the rest of their lives. Just 6 weeks earlier, I experienced the impact of a similar lesson, or maybe I should call it a shift in perspective that had powerfully impacted my life. I was walking the halls of a serene birth center in Japan, where we lived at the time, surrounded by the scent of cedarwood and the sound of a trickling fountain, supported by my husband via FaceTime from an ocean away, and minutes later, I birthed our 4th baby into my own hands. This moment of transcendence was so different from my original expectations of what birth would be like. In fact, when I became pregnant with our first baby 6 years earlier, to say I wasn't excited is an understatement. Don't get me wrong, I was delighted about becoming a mother, but there was one problem. First, I had to give birth. I had already been to enough of my friends' baby showers to hear the stories of those who had gone before me, and was predisposed to the idea that giving birth would and should be horrible. And then my eyes were open to a whole new world of possibility I had no idea existed. At first, I was skeptical about this renegade idea of an empowered, deeply supported, even peaceful childbirth experience that painted into possibility another way of doing things. I wasn't sure I believed it was possible, but I decided to learn everything I could just in case. And this decision was met with quite a hearty round of questioning and raised eyebrows from friends and family who loved me most. You see, choosing a renegade path, one that colors outside the lines of what is considered normal in any given culture, requires a willingness to be misunderstood, challenged, judged, labeled, rejected as reckless, and, when we consider the course of history, even burned at the stake. At first glance, the word renegade carries a nasty connotation associated by definition with traitors and villains. And I'm certain people like the Wright brothers, Marie Curie, Steve Jobs, and even the Honorable Ruth Bader Ginsburg spent most of their careers committed to the possibility of doing things another way. And you can be sure they took their fair share of shame, ridicule, misunderstanding, and scrutiny as they stayed the course and changed the reality of the modern world anyway. I'd revisit this concept of seeking my own path years later when tragedy struck and required I share the concept of grief with our babies after the loss of their father. I knew the stakes were high for them, which meant I needed to figure this out for myself first. The devastation of my grief was all-consuming, a potent and visceral ache that felt like it could swallow me whole. Grief left me feeling like an invisible, powerless victim of tragedy, with no way forward and no way out. There was no solid ground here, no hope, no dreaming, no joy. And the tactics for coping and surviving had such a limited view of possibility that left me feeling utterly hopeless. I knew that being forever consumed by my grief was not a path I wanted to walk. I wanted to live, not just survive the rest of my life. Is this really all there is now? What was different, however, was that my previously learned renegade thinking allowed me to peek out from behind the oppressive impossibility of grief to see if an alternative to a lifetime of pain existed. I looked for another possibility. Now, there was no evidence in plain sight that true living, not just surviving, was even possible, but reminiscent of my birth experiences years before, I went in search of non-traditional sources of healing and empowerment for the way ahead. I wasn't sure a happier ending was possible for me or my children, but I decided to leave no stone unturned, just in case. This enabled me to paint possibility alongside our pain, to create space for independent thought, bottomless questions, unfiltered emotions, and the right to choose what support we did and didn't need along the way. We didn't tuck our emotions away into empty platitudes or tidy responses to questions that really don't have answers. We learned to see this experience didn't define or limit us, and we started to understand how this profound perspective of loss was powerfully informing the way ahead, teaching us to love harder, live bigger, and truly understand what it is to feel deep joy in our belly, having also experienced this deep pain. This approach to grieving definitely took me down a renegade path again. And to those watching from the sidelines, there was some confusion and concern around my approach, just like my birth experiences. And once more, in subtle and not so subtle ways, I was asked to defend my decision to grieve and live the way that I did. But so many others before me managed to wake up every morning and make the bread and feed the children and rebuild the villages after the wars. And by recognizing this wasn't just my story, it enabled me to experience all the feels of my grief without giving up hope for the rest of my life. Now, I'm not suggesting we should turn to magical thinking or that you should push your feelings down and become numb. Grief is hard, period. The conscious choice to seek out the possibility of joy beyond my pain did not mean I never felt sad or had my future all figured out. I just knew this wasn't where my story ended. Grief leaves you forever changed, but doesn't have to mean forever suffering. I am suggesting that we allow grief to have full expression, which can be messy, ugly, angry, and painful, and healthy, intentional, supported expressions of grief inform renegade thinking. It shows us what we don't want, what we do want, what we're afraid of, what we need to ask for help with, and who our true blue community is. And this invaluable information makes the path to possibility accessible once more. In any moment, we're given the choice to stay where we are or take one tiny, courageous step forward, the true definition of hope. Telling my children their father had died was one of the most complicated things I've ever had to do, because it wasn't just about death and grief. That conversation was as much about living. Reframing limitation with renegade thinking is the birthplace of empowerment and hope that paves the way to possibility. And when you walk out of this room believing anything is possible because of this shift in perspective, you too can join the renegade movement of living life fully alive. Thank you.